In this chapter, we're going to talk about how banks create money. Understanding how banks create money is important to understanding monetary policy, which we will cover in the next chapter. I have the subtitle, Creating Something Out of Nothing, which effectively is what we do. Our money currently has no backing except the good faith of the U.S. government and the fact that we assume that the Federal Reserve will control it properly. There is no gold backing. Hasn't been since 1973, and probably we will never back it with anything again, simply because there's not enough gold or precious metals to back it with. How do we create money? Well, we have what is called a fractional reserve system. What this means is that the bank does not need to keep $1 of cash for every $1 of deposits. It only keeps a fraction of that $1. The portion it needs to keep as a reserve behind each $1 of deposits is called a required reserve. Assume our required reserve ratio is 10%, and someone places $100 in their account. The bank must keep 10% of this $100 as a required reserve, or $10. The remaining $90 is called an excess reserve. This excess reserve can be loaned out, and that is how the bank generates income for the bank, by loaning the excess reserves at interest. To show how money is created, let us use a simple T account. The basic accounting equation says assets equal liabilities plus equity. For this example, we will assume the equity is 0, so assets equal liabilities. Most books explain this using Monopoly Bank, but I simply assume that the money will stay in the banking system, since the banking system creates the money. We'll define money supply as we did before. It is demand deposits, also known as checkable deposits, plus currency in the hands of the public. The reason for this distinction is only money in the checkable deposits can create more money. Initially, we will assume that people hold no currency, but just checkable deposits. We will also assume that banks hold no excess reserves, but loan them all out. Assume you take $1,000 to the bank and place it in a checking account or demand deposit. Also assume the required reserve ratio is 10%. The T account will look like this. On the left-hand side, you have the assets. You have $100 in required reserves. $900 will be excess reserves. This gives us total reserves or total assets of $1,000. Our liabilities on the other side are the $1,000 demand deposits. In other words, this is a liability to the bank since they owe you $1,000 for you to receive on demand. This is what the bank's T account looks like. Note, though, at this point, if you had $1,000 you had in cash for a long time and placed it in the bank, there is no increase in the money supply. We have simply taken $1,000 in money in the hands of the public and placed it in a demand deposit. The next step begins to create new money. We now assume the bank loans that $900 to someone, and they take the $900, spend it, and the person that receives it now places it in their bank account. Below, we see the T accounts for the first bank and the second bank. The first bank is the same as we saw before, except now the excess reserve has become a loan. That $900 is received by a second individual or business. That goes into their accounts. That increases that second bank's liabilities by the $900 demand deposit. Now the required reserves are $90, 10% of that, and the excess reserves are $810. This gives us total assets or total reserves of $900. Note we're using RR for required reserves, ER for excess reserves, TA for total assets, and DD for demand deposits. We now have two accounts. The first account still has a demand deposit of $1,000, and the second one has a demand deposit of $900. This money supply has increased from $1,000 to $1,900. So we've effectively created another $900 in money based on the first $1,000 that went into the first bank. Now, assume the second bank loans out the $800 in excess reserves to an individual, and this is then deposited in another bank. We now show the T accounts for the second and third bank. The second bank, again, we saw this earlier, has required reserves of $90, has a demand deposit of $900, loan of $810, and total assets or total reserves of $900. I'm using total assets and total reserves interchangeably here. The next bank, the third bank, now has an $810 demand deposit. It has required reserves of 10% of that, or $81. It has excess reserves of $729, or total assets of $810. Now we have an account for $1,000, a second account for $900, and a third account for $810. This totals $2,710, and $1,710 is new money. Remember that first $1,000 was initially in the hands of the public, became a demand deposit, and was not counted as new money. Everything after that is. This will continue until all of the reserves are turned into required reserves. How much will this be? Well, it is $900 times the money multiplier. Remember, the $1,000 was already part of the money supply. The $900 was the first increase in excess reserves. The money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio, or 1 over 0.10, or 10. Thus, the money supply can increase by $9,000, or $900 times the money multiplier. What reduces money creation? Well, so far we've assumed the banks hold no excess reserves and the public holds no currency outside of banks. If these assumptions do not hold, then the banking system cannot create as much money. First, let us look at the holding of excess reserves. At times, banks may not be able to find good loans, or they simply want to hold excess reserves for safety. Another point we will note later is those excess reserves can be held at the Federal Reserve, and today the Federal Reserve actually pays interest on those excess reserves. Let us assume the first bank we looked at decides to hold excess reserves. This is shown in the T account below. We had a $1,000 demand deposit, required reserves of $100. They're now going to hold an extra $100 in excess reserves, either because they can't find somebody to loan it to, or they just want to do it for safety. And they will have a loan for $800. This goes as total assets, or total reserves still of $1,000. In the above slide, we see the bank held $100 in excess reserves and only loaned out $800. Even if the remaining banks loan everything out, the banking system will only create $800 times 10, or $8,000 in new money. If the other banks decide to hold additional excess reserves, this will be reduced even more. Thus, holding excess reserves and not loaning them reduces the amount of new money that can be created. Now let us assume the first person that takes the $900 loan simply decides to take it home and stick it in his safe. In this case, the money in the hands of the public increases, but since the $900 is not placed in another bank, there is no more expansion of the money supply. It is simply stopped. We can see that if suddenly the public decided to withdraw all of their money and hold it as cash, the banks would not be able to loan any money, and in fact would need to reduce loans. This has happened at times in U.S. history, and this is called a bank panic. We've had major depressions, 4 total. All were preceded pretty much by bank panics. We saw that as banks loan money, the banking system increased the money supply. As loans are paid off, the money supply is reduced if banks do not find another person to lend it to. If the first loan of $900 is repaid, that means all the loans based on that must be reduced, and this contracts money supply. Of course, in our system, there are so many loans being made and repaid each day, it does not do this, and the money supply tends to increase over time. So our conclusion is that in this chapter, we have seen how our fractional reserve system allows us to create money. We have also discussed how money supply can be destroyed. In the next chapter, we will see how the Federal Reserve uses this to enact monetary policy and control interest rates.